Hey everyone, welcome back to Mythic Dreamscapes. Tonight we're diving deep into one of the most enduring and powerful stories from Greek mythology. A tale of prophecy and fate, of beauty transformed into horror, of heroes and monsters, and of a quest that would echo through the centuries. This is the story of Perseus and Medusa. So settle in, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let's journey back to ancient Greece together. Before we begin, if you're enjoying the content here on the channel, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you these deep dives into mythology from around the world. And I'd love to know where you're tuning in from tonight and what time it is for you. Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see this community spread across the globe, all gathering here for these ancient stories. The myth of Perseus and Medusa is one that has survived not just decades or centuries, but millennia. It's been painted on ancient Greek pottery, carved into Roman marble, retold by Renaissance poets, and reimagined in countless modern films, books, and artworks. There's something about this story that speaks to something fundamental in the human experience: the clash between beauty and horror, the thin line between victim and monster, the way prophecy can become a self-fulfilling trap, and perhaps most powerfully, the image of Medusa herself, the woman with serpents for hair whose gaze could turn you to stone. She's become an icon that transcends her original myth, a symbol that has been interpreted and reinterpreted across cultures and centuries. But tonight we're going back to the beginning. We're going to explore not just how Perseus slayed the Gorgon, but why. We'll look at Medusa before she became a monster, at the injustice that transformed her, and at the complicated legacy both she and Perseus left behind. This isn't just a simple tale of hero and villain. Like all the best Greek myths, it's layered with tragedy, irony, and truths about power, gender, and the cruel whims of the gods. So let's begin where all great Greek tragedies begin, with a prophecy. Our story starts in Argos, one of the most ancient and powerful cities in Greece. Sometime in the misty age when gods still walked openly among mortals and heroes could be born from impossible unions. The city was ruled by King Acrisius, a man who had everything a Greek king could want: wealth, power, a beautiful wife named Eurydice, everything except the one thing that mattered most in that world: a son. Acrisius had only one child, a daughter named Danae. She was lovely, kind, everything a father could want in a daughter. But in the world of ancient Greece, daughters couldn't inherit the throne. Daughters couldn't carry on the family name or ensure the dynasty would continue. As the years passed and no son came, Acrisius grew desperate. So he did what desperate Greek kings always did when faced with an uncertain future. He consulted the oracle at Delphi. Now, if you know anything about Greek mythology, you know that consulting oracles rarely goes the way you hope. The oracle of Delphi, the Pythia who spoke for Apollo himself, had a habit of delivering truths that were both crystal clear and devastatingly cruel. When Acrisius asked about his future, about whether he would ever have a son to inherit his kingdom, the oracle's answer must have chilled his blood. "No," the oracle told him, "you will never have a son, but your daughter will bear a child, a boy, and that grandson will be the one who kills you." Imagine receiving that prophecy. The very thing you longed for, a male heir, would come through your daughter, but that heir would be your murderer. For Acrisius, the prophecy wasn't just a warning. It was a death sentence wrapped in inevitability. But Acrisius, like so many others in Greek mythology, made the fatal mistake of thinking he could outwit fate. If the problem was that Danae would bear a son, then the solution was simple: keep Danae from ever bearing any children at all. So King Acrisius did something that, even by the standards of Greek mythology, was particularly cruel. He had a prison built. Not an ordinary prison, but a bronze chamber constructed beneath his palace. Some versions of the myth describe it as a tower with bronze walls, sealed tight. Others say it was underground, buried beneath the earth where no man could reach. Either way, it was a tomb for the living. Acrisius locked his own daughter inside this bronze prison, sealed away from the world, from sunlight, from love, from any possibility of bearing the grandson who would kill him. Danae must have been terrified, confused. What had she done to deserve this punishment? Her only crime was existing, being born female in a world that valued sons. being the vehicle through which a prophecy would unfold. She was imprisoned not for her actions, but for her potential, locked away because of what might happen, what the gods had decreed would happen. The bronze chamber became her entire world, no windows, or just a tiny opening to let in air and the faintest hint of light. No visitors, no hope of escape. Just walls of bronze and the endless suffocating certainty that this would be the rest of her life. But here's the thing about Greek mythology. Here's the thing about fate. You can build bronze walls, you can bury someone deep beneath the earth, you can try with all your mortal strength to prevent what the gods have ordained. And it won't matter, not even slightly, because Zeus, king of the gods, lord of Olympus, master of thunder and lightning, had noticed Danae. Perhaps he'd seen her before her imprisonment, walking through the gardens of her father's palace. Perhaps he only noticed her after she was locked away, drawn by her prayers or her tears, or simply by the challenge of reaching someone supposedly unreachable. Either way, Zeus desired her, and when Zeus desired something, very little could stand in his way. Now Zeus had a particular talent for creative problem-solving when it came to reaching mortal women. He'd transformed himself into a swan to seduce Leda, a bull to carry off Europa, a satyr to approach Antiope. For Danae, locked in her bronze prison, Zeus chose perhaps his most unusual form. He came to her as a shower of gold. Picture it. Danae alone in her bronze chamber in darkness or near darkness, resigned to her fate. And then, through whatever crack or opening allowed air into her prison, gold begins to pour. Not solid gold, but liquid, golden light, golden rain, cascading down into her chamber, pooling around her, and then not around her, but within her. Zeus, in the form of this golden shower, impregnated Danae. The king of the gods had breached the bronze walls that her father had thought impenetrable. Some ancient writers tried to rationalize this. They suggested the golden shower was actually gold coins, that someone had been bribed to give Danae access to a lover. But the myth in its pure form is more powerful and stranger. Zeus came as golden rain, as light made liquid, as something that could slip through any barrier. It was an act of divine power and also divine violation, because we should be clear about something. Danae didn't ask for this. She couldn't consent to this. She was a prisoner visited by a god who took what he wanted, without regard for what she wanted. This is a pattern we'll see again in this story, and it's one of the darker threads running through Greek mythology. 9 months later, alone in her bronze prison, Danae gave birth to a son. She named him Perseus. For a while, somehow, she managed to keep the baby hidden. Can you imagine trying to keep an infant quiet in a prison? Every cry, every whimper could betray them. But eventually, inevitably, Acrisius discovered the truth. He came to the bronze chamber and found his daughter with a baby boy. His first reaction might have been joy, a grandson, an heir, everything he'd wanted. But then he would have remembered the prophecy. This child, this innocent baby, was prophesied to kill him. Acrisius faced a terrible choice. He couldn't simply kill the child. Greek religion was very clear about the consequences of kinslaying, of murdering your own family. The Furies, ancient spirits of vengeance, would hunt him down. And besides, if Zeus really was the father, as Danae claimed, killing the son of Zeus would bring down the wrath of the king of the gods himself. But he couldn't keep them around either. The prophecy hung over him like a blade. So Acrisius came up with what he probably thought was a clever compromise. He would neither kill his daughter and grandson directly, nor allow them to remain near him. Instead, he would place them in the hands of fate, or more specifically, in the hands of Poseidon, god of the sea. Acrisius had a large wooden chest built, sturdy enough to float but sealed so it couldn't easily be opened from inside. He placed Danae and baby Perseus inside this chest, sealed it shut, and had it carried down to the shore. There his servants pushed it out into the waves. As far as Acrisius was concerned, he'd solved his problem. If Danae and Perseus drowned, well, that was the will of the gods, not his fault. If they somehow survived, they'd be far away from Argos, far from him, unable to fulfill the prophecy. Either way, his hands would be clean of their blood. But fate, as we've established, is not so easily avoided, and the gods, particularly Zeus, were watching. The chest drifted on the wine-dark sea. Inside, Danae held her infant son, terrified but trying to be brave, singing to him softly, praying to whatever gods might listen. The chest rocked on the waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent, as storms came and went. Days passed, or was it only hours? Time becomes strange when you're trapped in darkness, surrounded by the sound of water, not knowing if the next wave will be the one that pulls you under. But Poseidon, responding to Zeus's silent command, calmed the waters around the chest. The currents, rather than pulling it down to a watery grave, carried it east and south. Until finally, after what must have felt like an eternity to Danae, the chest washed up on a beach. The island of Seriphos. Seriphos was a small island in the Aegean, rocky and not particularly prosperous, but peaceful. It was ruled by King Polydectes, and it was here that the wooden chest carrying Danae and Perseus came to rest, caught in the nets of a fisherman named Dictys. Imagine being Dictys that morning. You're pulling in your nets, expecting fish, maybe hoping for a particularly good catch. Instead, your nets are heavy with something large, rectangular, wooden. You drag it to shore and discover it's a sealed chest. Do you leave it? Do you try to open it? Dictys chose to open it, and inside he found a young woman and a baby, both somehow alive after their impossible journey. Dictys was a good man. In a world of myths filled with selfish kings and cruel gods, he stands out as someone genuinely kind. He was also, importantly, the brother of King Polydectes, which gave him some status and protection on the island. When he found Danae and Perseus, he didn't question where they came from or why. He simply took them in. He gave them shelter in his own home, food from his own table. He became, in essence, Perseus's foster father. For several years, life was peaceful. Perseus grew from a baby to a boy, then from a boy to a young man. Danae, though she must have carried the trauma of her imprisonment and the terror of the voyage in the chest, found a kind of peace on Seriphos. She had her son. She had Dictys's protection and kindness. She had escaped her father's cruelty and survived the sea. It must have felt, for a while, like the worst was behind them. But peace in Greek mythology is always temporary, and trouble, when it came from Dictys's brother, King Polydectes. Polydectes was not like his brother. Where Dictys was kind and generous, Polydectes was selfish and scheming. And Polydectes had noticed Danae. She was beautiful, and though the years had passed since she'd been the imprisoned princess in Argos, she still carried herself with a certain grace, a certain nobility. Polydectes desired her. He wanted her as his wife, or perhaps, less nobly, as his possession. But there was a problem: Perseus. By this time, Perseus was a young man, strong and protective of his mother. Every time Polydectes approached Danae, made advances or suggestions, Perseus was there, standing between them, making it clear that his mother was not interested and was under his protection. Polydectes began to see Perseus not as Dictys's ward, but as an obstacle. Now Polydectes could have simply had Perseus killed. He was the king, after all. He had the power. But that would be messy. It would anger Dictys. It might turn public opinion against him. And besides, there were rumors about Perseus, whispers that his father was Zeus himself. Better not to risk the wrath of Olympus. So Polydectes devised a plan that was cunning in its cruelty. He announced that he was going to marry, not Danae, but Hippodamia, another woman entirely. This was a lie, but it allowed him to host a celebration, a gathering where every man on the island was expected to bring a gift suitable for the occasion. Horses were traditional. Wealthy gifts were expected. It was a way for the men of the island to show their loyalty and their status. Perseus, of course, had nothing. He and his mother lived on Dictys's charity. They had no wealth, no horses, nothing that would be considered an appropriate gift. When Perseus arrived at the celebration empty-handed, Polydectes made a great show of his disappointment. How could Perseus come to such an important occasion without a gift? What kind of man shows such disrespect to his king? Perseus, young and proud, rose to the bait. He declared that he would bring Polydectes any gift the king desired, anything at all to prove his worth. And Polydectes, as if the thought had just occurred to him, suggested something impossible. If Perseus really wanted to prove himself, if he really wanted to show he was worthy of living on Seriphos, he could bring back the head of Medusa. The room must have gone silent. Everyone knew the stories of Medusa, one of the three Gorgons, monsters so terrible that simply looking at them would turn you to stone. Many men had set out to slay the Gorgons. None had returned. Polydectes was essentially sentencing Perseus to death, but he was doing it in a way that made it Perseus's own choice, his own boast. If Perseus died on this quest, well, it was his own fault for being so prideful. Perseus, trapped by his own words and his youth and his desire to protect his mother, accepted the challenge. He would retrieve the head of Medusa. He would accomplish the impossible, or he would die trying. As Perseus left to prepare for his journey, Polydectes smiled. The obstacle was removing itself. Danae would soon be unprotected, and the boy who'd stood between the king and what he wanted would be dead in some distant land, turned to stone by a monster's gaze. But Polydectes had made a critical miscalculation. He'd forgotten, or perhaps never truly believed, the rumors about Perseus's parentage. Perseus was not just some fisherman's ward. He was a son of Zeus, and the gods, whatever their flaws, tended to look after their own. But before we follow Perseus on his quest, we need to step back before Perseus was born, before Danae was imprisoned, back to a time when the monster he'd been sent to slay was not yet a monster at all. This is the part of the story that's often forgotten or glossed over. The part that makes Medusa not just a monster to be slain, but a tragedy, a victim, a woman who was punished for crimes committed against her. But here's something crucial we need to understand. The story I'm about to tell you, the one where Medusa was transformed from a beautiful woman into a monster, comes primarily from the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses, written around 8 CE. The earlier Greek sources, like Hesiod's Theogony from the 7th or 8th century BCE, simply described Medusa as being born a Gorgon, one of 3 monstrous sisters. There was no transformation in those earlier versions, no tragic backstory. She was simply a monster from birth. But Ovid's version became the most famous, the one that has dominated the cultural imagination for 2,000 years, so it's this version we'll explore. In Ovid's telling, Medusa was not always a Gorgon. Once, she was simply a young woman, and by all accounts, she was extraordinarily beautiful. Medusa was one of 3 sisters, daughters of ancient sea deities named Perseus and Cetus. These were old gods, primordial forces associated with the dangers of the ocean. Their children reflected that dangerous nature. Medusa's 2 sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were born as Gorgons, as monsters. They were immortal creatures with brass hands, golden wings, and serpents for hair. They were terrifying from birth, embodiments of the deadly aspects of the sea. But Medusa was different. She was born mortal, born beautiful, born human. Of the 3 Gorgon sisters, she alone could die. And of the 3, she alone was lovely enough to catch the attention of gods and men alike. Her most remarkable feature, according to the ancient writers, was her hair. Long, lustrous, flowing like waves, more beautiful than anything any mortal woman could boast. When men saw Medusa, they were captivated. When women saw her, they felt envy. She was that rare kind of beauty that seems almost inhuman in its perfection. And Medusa, aware of her beauty, but also aware of its dangers, chose a path that would protect her according to Ovid's account. She became a devotee at Athena's temple. Later interpretations would describe her as a priestess taking vows of chastity, though Ovid himself simply says the violation occurred in Minerva's, Athena's temple. For the purposes of understanding how this story has been told and retold, we'll follow the commonly accepted version where she was a priestess. In this telling, she was held in high esteem, kept safe within the temple walls, her virginity protected by the sacred nature of the space. Medusa must have felt safe there, honored, protected by one of the most powerful goddesses on Olympus. She should have been safe. The temple was sacred ground. The priestesses were under Athena's direct protection. No one would dare violate that sanctity. But Medusa had caught the attention of another god, one who was not known for respecting boundaries or caring about the sanctity of other gods' temples. Poseidon, god of the sea, god of earthquakes, god of horses, brother to Zeus himself. Poseidon saw Medusa and desired her. Now let's be very clear about what happened next in Ovid's version, because this is often softened or romanticized in the retellings. In Ovid's account, Neptune, Poseidon, did not court Medusa. He did not seduce her. What happened in Minerva's, Athena's temple was rape, according to Ovid's telling. He saw what he wanted and he took it, with no regard for her vows, her wishes, or the sanctity of the place. It's worth noting that in the earlier Greek sources, the relationship between Poseidon and Medusa was described differently, with Hesiod simply stating they lay together in a soft meadow with spring flowers, with no mention of rape. But Ovid's version, with its explicit violence and injustice, is the one that captured the cultural imagination and shaped how Western culture would remember Medusa for the next 2 millennia. Medusa, after this violation, must have been shattered. She'd been a virgin priestess, devoted to her goddess, and now that had been taken from her in the most brutal way possible. But surely, she might have thought, surely Athena would protect her now. Surely the goddess would punish Poseidon for this desecration of her temple. Surely there would be justice. But the gods of Olympus were not known for their justice, particularly not when it came to protecting mortal women from the predations of male gods. What happened next is one of the great injustices of Greek mythology, and it's crucial to understanding why Medusa's story resonates so powerfully even today. Athena did not punish Poseidon. She could have, she had the power. But Poseidon was her uncle, one of the 3 great gods who divided the cosmos between them. Challenging him would mean making an enemy, would mean upsetting the balance of power on Olympus. And besides, gods didn't punish each other for what they did to mortals. That simply wasn't how divine politics worked. So instead, Athena punished Medusa. The victim became the criminal. The woman who had been violated became the monster. Athena, in her rage at the desecration of her temple, transformed Medusa into something hideous, something that could never again tempt the eye of any god or man. Her beautiful hair, the hair that had been her glory, the hair that Poseidon had admired, turned into living serpents that writhed and hissed around her head. Her lovely face became distorted, terrible to look upon. And her eyes, those eyes that had once held only beauty, were cursed with a terrible power. Anyone who looked directly into Medusa's eyes would be instantly transformed into stone. This was not a gift. This was not protection. This was punishment. Athena had taken everything from Medusa: her beauty, her humanity, her ability to connect with anyone, because now Medusa couldn't look at anyone without killing them. She couldn't have friends, couldn't have family, couldn't have any kind of normal life. Every person who saw her face died. Every person who met her eyes became a statue. Medusa was banished from the temple, from civilization, from everything she'd known. She fled to the edges of the world, to the far west, where the ancient geographers placed all manner of terrible things, beyond the river ocean that was thought to encircle the known world. There, in a desolate place where no humans dared to venture, she lived with her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, the only beings she could be near without killing. The sisters had a cave, or perhaps several caves. The ancient sources disagree on the exact location. Some placed them near the Garden of the Hesperides. Others said they lived on an island beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. Still others claimed they were in Libya, in the deserts of North Africa. Wherever exactly they were, it was a place of isolation, a place of sorrow. Medusa had been transformed from victim to monster, and now she lived as an exile. Her only companions, her immortal monster sisters, and the stone statues of men who'd come to kill her. Because that's what men did. They heard of the terrible Gorgon, the monster whose gaze turned people to stone, and they came seeking glory. They came to be the hero who slayed the monster. And they became stone, frozen forever in their last moment of life, decorating the approach to the Gorgon's lair like terrible warnings that no one heeded. How many came? How many statues surrounded Medusa's cave? Dozens? Hundreds? Each one a man who'd seen her not as a person, not as a woman who'd been wronged, but as a monster to be killed, a prize to be claimed. And each one, in looking at her, in meeting her cursed eyes, became stone. Medusa must have hated them, must have hated all of them. The gods who'd done this to her, the men who kept coming to kill her, the world that had turned her into something terrible and then blamed her for the terror. She'd been transformed into exactly what the ancient world feared most in women: powerful, uncontrollable, dangerous, deadly. She'd become the embodiment of female rage, frozen in a form that killed anyone who looked at her. But she was also still, in some sense, a victim. Still the woman who'd been assaulted in a temple and then cursed for it. Still the priestess who'd done nothing wrong except be beautiful and be seen by a god who took what he wanted. The monster and the maiden existed in the same body, trapped in a cave at the edge of the world, waiting for the next man who thought he could be the hero of her story. And eventually, that man came. His name was Perseus. Perseus was young, brave, and completely out of his depth. He'd accepted an impossible quest out of pride and love for his mother, but now he had to actually attempt it. He had no army, no resources, no real plan. How do you kill something you can't look at? How do you even find creatures that live at the edge of the world? Perseus might have spent some time on Seriphos trying to figure this out, asking old sailors and fishermen if they'd heard stories of where the Gorgons lived. But his quest might have ended before it truly began, if not for divine intervention. The gods had been watching Perseus since his birth. Zeus, his father, had kept a distant eye on his son, as he did with all his numerous offspring. But more importantly, Athena had been watching. Now you might wonder why Athena would help Perseus kill Medusa. After all, Medusa had been her priestess. But remember, Athena was the one who'd cursed Medusa in the first place. In Athena's mind, Medusa was not a victim, but a defilement of her temple. And besides, there were strategic reasons. Medusa's head, even after death, would retain its petrifying power. That kind of weapon belonged with the gods, specifically with Athena herself. So Athena revealed herself to Perseus. The goddess of wisdom appeared to the young hero, shining with divine light, and offered her guidance. With her came Hermes, the messenger god, the trickster, the guide of travelers, and the one who moved between worlds. Together, these two Olympians would ensure that Perseus had what he needed to succeed, where so many others had failed. But before Perseus could face Medusa, he needed equipment, special equipment, the kind of magical items that only gods could provide, or that were hidden in places only gods knew about. Athena explained what Perseus would need for his quest. Now, the ancient sources vary on exactly who provided which items. Some say Hermes gave certain gifts, others credit different gods, or the nymphs called the Hesperides. But the core items Perseus needed remained consistent across the retellings. First, a sword. Not just any sword, but a harp. A special curved blade sharp enough to cut through anything, even the bronze skin of a Gorgon. This blade from Olympus itself was forged by Hephaestus, the smith god, with sources variously crediting Hermes or Zeus himself with providing it to Perseus. Its edge was divine, unbreakable, perfect for the task ahead. Second, a shield. But Perseus couldn't use the shield in the normal way for blocking and parrying. He needed it as a mirror. Athena gave him her own shield, or in some versions, a shield polished to a mirror brightness. The shield's surface was reflective enough that Perseus could see Medusa's reflection without looking at her directly. This was crucial. The curse only worked if you looked into Medusa's eyes. A reflection was safe. Third, winged sandals. Perseus needed to fly to reach the Gorgon's distant lair and to escape after he'd completed his task. These magical sandals, most commonly attributed to Hermes lending his own divine footwear, though some sources say they came from the nymphs, allowed the wearer to soar through the air as easily as walking. Fourth, the helm of Hades, also called the cap of invisibility. This was a helmet that made its wearer completely invisible, impossible to see or sense. With this, Perseus could approach unseen and escape undetected. And finally, a special bag called a kibisis. This was important because even after Medusa was dead, her head would still be dangerous. Anyone who looked at it would still turn to stone. The kibisis was a magical satchel that could safely contain the head, keeping its power contained until Perseus needed to use it. Armed with these divine gifts, Perseus was ready, or as ready as any mortal could be to face a Gorgon. But there was still the problem of actually finding them. The Gorgons lived at the edge of the world, and the exact location was a secret. But Athena and Hermes knew who had that secret. The Graeae sisters, the only ones who knew the way to their monstrous relatives. The Graeae were strange creatures, even by the standards of Greek mythology. They were sisters to the Gorgons, daughters of the same ancient sea deities, Phorcys and Cetus. But where the Gorgons were young and terrible, the Graeae were ancient. Their name meant the grey ones, and they were old from birth, born with grey hair and withered skin. They were sometimes called the Phorcides, daughters of Phorcys, and some sources said there were 2 of them, while others insisted there were 3. The most common tradition names 3 Graeae: Dano, whose name meant dread or terror, Enyo, which meant warlike or horror, and Pemphredo, alarm or she who guides the way. Their names alone tell you they were not gentle creatures. They were personifications of fear, of the dread that grips you in the dark, of the ancient terror of the unknown. But the most striking thing about the Graeae was what they shared. Between the 3 of them, they had only one eye, a single eye that they passed among themselves, each sister taking a turn to see while the others remained blind. They also shared a single tooth, which they used in the same way, passing it from mouth to mouth when they needed to eat. This strange detail, the sharing of a single eye and tooth, has been interpreted in many ways. Some scholars think it might have been a metaphor for how closely linked they were, how they functioned as one being despite being 3 separate sisters. Others see it as symbolic of the way knowledge is shared, passed from one to another. Still others think it represents incompleteness, that none of them was whole on her own. The Graeae lived in a cave in that same distant western region where their Gorgon sisters dwelt. They were watchers, guardians who kept the location of the Gorgons secret. Whether they did this to protect their sisters, or simply because they were territorial and cruel, the myths don't say, but they were the gatekeepers. Anyone who wanted to find the Gorgons had to get past the Graeae first. Many heroes had tried. All had failed. The Graeae were not just guardians, but obstacles in their own right. They could sense intruders approaching, and though they were old and withered, they were still dangerous, still connected to ancient primordial forces. Trying to force information from them was futile. Trying to sneak past them was impossible. They had their eye, and while only one could see at a time, they were vigilant. Perseus, guided by Athena and Hermes, knew he couldn't simply demand the information or fight for it. He needed to be clever. He needed to use cunning, not strength, and that's exactly what he did. Perseus found the Graeae's cave and waited, hidden by the helm of invisibility, watching. He observed their routine, the way they passed the eye between them. There was a moment, a brief moment during the exchange, when none of them had the eye. When one sister was handing it to another, for just a heartbeat it was held by neither. That was Perseus's opportunity. He waited for that precise moment. One of the Graeae removed the eye from her socket, holding it in her withered hand, reaching to pass it to her sister. And in that instant, Perseus darted forward, his hand shooting out from his invisibility, and snatched the eye away. The reaction must have been immediate and terrifying. All 3 sisters suddenly blind, their one eye stolen, screaming and clutching at the air, trying to find the thief they couldn't see. Perseus, still invisible, stepped back and watched them flail and rage. Then he spoke. He told them who he was and what he wanted, the location of the Gorgon's lair, the exact directions to reach Medusa, and if they told him truly, he would return their eye. If they refused, well, they would remain blind forever. It wasn't a threat, exactly. Just a statement of fact. He had their eye. They wanted it back. The price was information. The Graeae, furious but powerless, had no choice. Some versions say they bargained, tried to negotiate, offered other things. But Perseus was firm. The location of the Gorgons, nothing else would do. Eventually they gave in. They told him exactly where to find his prey. They described the journey, the landmarks, the approach to the cave where Medusa and her sisters dwelt. And then came the moment of truth. Would Perseus keep his word and return the eye? Some versions of the myth say yes, that he tossed it back to the Graeae once he had the information he needed. He'd gotten what he wanted, and there was no point in being needlessly cruel. Other versions say he threw the eye into Lake Tritonis, leaving the Graeae permanently blind as punishment for protecting the Gorgons. Still other variants have him simply leaving, walking away with the eye still in his possession, the Graeae's cries fading behind him as he headed toward his true target. Whichever version is true, Perseus now had what he needed. He knew where to find Medusa. The quest could continue. The impossible task was one step closer to completion, but the hardest part, the most dangerous part, still lay ahead. He had to actually face the Gorgons. He had to kill a monster that had killed countless heroes before him, and he had to do it without looking at her face. Perseus flew across the world, carried by Hermes' winged sandals. He traveled west, always west, following the directions the Graeae had given him. Past lands he knew, past the edges of maps, into regions that Greeks thought of as the very boundaries of the world. The journey must have taken days, perhaps longer. Time gets strange in myths, bending and compressing, but the distance was vast. He flew over seas and mountains, over deserts and strange lands. Some versions say he passed the realm of the Hesperides, the nymphs who guarded the golden apples in their garden at the world's edge. Others say he flew near the Titan Atlas, who held up the sky with his strength. Though the encounter between Perseus and Atlas comes later in the story in most tellings, either way, Perseus was venturing into regions no ordinary mortal had ever seen, places that existed more in myth than in any geography. Finally he saw it. A desolate island, or perhaps a stretch of rocky coastland, grey and lifeless. And scattered across the approaches, like grotesque sculptures in some mad artist's garden, were statues, stone figures frozen in poses of terror, men with swords raised, mouths open in screams. Expressions of absolute horror fixed forever on their stone faces. These were the men who had come before Perseus, heroes who'd attempted this same quest, warriors who'd sought glory by slaying the Gorgon. All of them had failed. All of them had looked upon Medusa's face and been transformed instantly from living flesh to cold stone. Perseus must have felt a chill seeing them. This was going to be his fate if he made even a single mistake. There was no margin for error here, but he'd come too far to turn back. His mother's safety depended on him completing this quest. His own honor was at stake, and besides, he had advantages these other heroes hadn't. Divine weapons, a divine plan, the gods themselves supporting him. He approached slowly, carefully, making no sound. The helm of Hades rendered him invisible, which meant he could get close without being detected. This was crucial because while Medusa was the mortal Gorgon, her two sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were immortal. Perseus couldn't kill them. If they detected him before he'd completed his task, they would tear him apart, divine weapons or not. As he drew closer to the cave, he could hear sounds, the hissing of serpents. Serpents were everywhere in this place, not just the ones that made up Medusa's hair, but ordinary snakes too, drawn to this place of transformation and death, and he could hear breathing. The Gorgons were sleeping. This was perfect. This was as good as Perseus could have hoped. If the Gorgons were asleep, he could approach one directly, complete his task, and escape before the others even woke. But which one was Medusa? That was the question. In the dim light of the cave, Perseus couldn't tell which of the sleeping forms was the mortal Gorgon and which were her immortal sisters. He'd have to get closer, examine them somehow. Here's where Athena's shield proved crucial. Perseus drew closer, shield held before him, looking not at the sleeping Gorgons, but at their reflections in the polished bronze. In the reflection, he could see them clearly without risk. Two of them had wings, brass claws, bodies that were clearly inhuman, but the third, the one in the center, though her face was terrible and her hair writhed with serpents, had a more human form. This was Medusa, the mortal one, his target. Perseus crept forward, every movement calculated, every step silent. He could see in his shield's reflection that Medusa was deeply asleep. Her serpent hair was still, coiled around her head like a terrible crown. Her eyes were closed. This was his chance. This was the only chance he'd get. He raised the harp, the curved divine sword. He positioned himself carefully, using the shield to guide him, seeing Medusa's reflection, but never once looking at her directly. And then, in one swift, decisive motion, he brought the blade down on her neck. The sword, forged by Hephaestus, sharp enough to cut through divine flesh, sliced through cleanly. Medusa's head separated from her body in a single stroke. Perseus grabbed it immediately, even as it fell, being careful to hold it by the serpent hair, keeping those eyes pointed away from him. He shoved it into the kibisis, the magical bag that would contain its power. And then something happened that Perseus couldn't have anticipated, though perhaps Athena had known it would occur. From Medusa's severed neck, from the blood that poured out, two beings suddenly emerged. First came Pegasus, the magnificent winged horse, pure white, perfect, soaring up out of the blood and immediately taking flight. Then came Chrysaor, a warrior born fully grown and armed, his name meaning golden sword. These were Medusa's children, conceived during Poseidon's assault on her, carried within her body all this time, born only in the moment of her death. This detail adds another layer of tragedy to Medusa's story. She'd been pregnant when she was transformed. The violation by Poseidon had left her with child, actually with two children, divine or semi-divine beings who'd been growing inside her cursed form. And they were only freed, only born when she was killed. Medusa died without ever knowing she'd been carrying these lives within her. But Perseus had no time to contemplate this. The sound, the smell of blood, the sudden birth of Pegasus and Chrysaor, all of it woke Medusa's sisters. Stheno and Euryale roared, a sound like metal scraping metal, and launched themselves at Perseus. They could see him now. The helm of invisibility only worked for mortals and monsters, not for these ancient primordial beings. They came at him with their brass claws extended, their wings beating, their terrible faces twisted in rage. Perseus ran, or rather he flew, the winged sandals carrying him up and away from the cave faster than he'd ever moved before. Stheno and Euryale pursued, flying after him, screaming their sister's name, promising vengeance. But Perseus had the head start, and the sandals of Hermes were faster even than the Gorgon's immortal wings. He pulled the helm of Hades back on as he flew, becoming invisible again, and the sisters lost sight of him in the vast sky. They searched, circling and calling out, but Perseus was gone. He'd done it. He'd accomplished the impossible. The head of Medusa was secure in the kibisis. The quest that was meant to kill him had been completed, and now he could return home. But the journey back would not be straightforward. Perseus had Medusa's head, a weapon of incredible power, and the gods had not told him that his adventure was far from over. Perseus flew east, back toward Greece, back toward Seriphos and his mother. But the journey was long, and as he crossed over the northeastern parts of Africa, he saw something that made him pause in his flight. Below him, on a coastline where waves crashed against dark rocks, a young woman was chained to a stone. She was positioned so that the incoming tide would eventually reach her, and she wore the kind of elaborate clothing and jewelry that marked her as nobility. But what struck Perseus most was not her finery but her expression. She wasn't struggling against her chains. She stood with a kind of resigned dignity, waiting for whatever was coming for her. Perseus descended, landing on the rocks near the chained woman. Up close he could see she was extraordinarily beautiful, but her beauty was overshadowed by her situation. Why would anyone chain a woman of such obvious wealth and status to a rock by the sea? The woman, whose name was Andromeda, was startled by Perseus's sudden appearance, appearing seemingly out of nowhere as he removed the helm of Hades. But she didn't scream or plead. Instead, she explained her situation with a kind of weary calm. Her mother was Queen Cassiopeia of Ethiopia, and Cassiopeia had made a terrible mistake. She'd boasted publicly and pridefully that she, or in some versions, her daughter Andromeda, was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs who attended Poseidon. This kind of hubris, this comparing of mortals to divine beings, was exactly the sort of thing that angered the gods. The Nereids, insulted and furious, complained to Poseidon. And Poseidon, that same god who had violated Medusa in Athena's temple, that same god who took offense easily and punished mortals for the slightest perceived insult, decided to punish Ethiopia. He sent a flood to ravage the coastline, and he sent a sea monster, a creature called Cetus, to terrorize the kingdom. Ships were destroyed, fishermen were devoured. The coastal towns lived in constant fear of when the monster would appear next. King Cepheus, Andromeda's father, desperate to save his kingdom, consulted the oracle of Ammon. and the oracle's answer was clear and cruel. The only way to appease Poseidon, the only way to make the sea monster leave, was to sacrifice Andromeda. Chain her to the rocks as an offering to Cetus. Let the monster devour the king's daughter, and the god's wrath would be satisfied. So here she was, Andromeda, an innocent victim of her mother's pride and her father's desperation, chained to a rock, waiting to be eaten by a sea monster to satisfy a god's anger. It was, as you might notice, a pattern. Medusa punished for Poseidon's crime. Andromeda sacrificed for her mother's words. Again and again in Greek mythology, women paid the price for others' actions. But Perseus, looking at Andromeda, felt something. Maybe it was love at first sight, as the romantic versions claim. Maybe it was a sense of justice, a recognition of one more woman being sacrificed to male pride and divine anger. Maybe it was simply the heroic impulse, seeing someone in need and wanting to help. Whatever his motivation, Perseus immediately decided he would save her. He asked if he could have her hand in marriage if he defeated the monster and rescued her. Some versions have him asking her parents, who appeared on the shore having come to say goodbye to their daughter. Other versions have him asking Andromeda herself. Either way, the answer was yes. Of course, yes. Perseus could have anything he wanted if he could actually defeat Cetus. And then the sea began to churn. The monster was coming. Cetus emerged from the depths, and it was enormous. Ancient descriptions vary on exactly what it looked like. Some describe it as a massive serpent, others as something like a dragon, still others as an enormous whale-like creature. But all agree it was huge, terrible, and had jaws large enough to swallow Andromeda whole. Perseus rose into the air on his winged sandals. He drew his divine sword, and he prepared to fight a sea monster, which, when you think about it, was not what he'd signed up for when he left Seriphos. One quest had somehow become two, but Perseus had confidence now. He'd killed a Gorgon. Surely he could handle a sea monster. The battle was intense. Cetus was not just large but fast in the water, lunging and snapping, trying to grab Perseus out of the air. Perseus dove and weaved, striking when he could, his divine blade cutting into the creature's hide. Some versions say he used Medusa's head, pulling it from the kibbasis and showing it to the monster, turning Cetus to stone in an instant. Other versions have him fighting with sword alone, a more traditional heroic combat. Either way, Perseus prevailed. The sea monster was slain, its enormous body sinking back into the waves or turned to stone on the beach, depending on the telling. Andromeda was saved. Perseus quickly broke her chains, freeing her from the rock where she'd been left to die. The king and queen, watching from the shore, were overjoyed. Not only was their daughter alive, but the monster was dead. The threat to their kingdom was ended, and they'd gained a hero as a son-in-law, Perseus, son of Zeus, slayer of Medusa, now also the man who'd defeated Cetus. Preparations began immediately for a wedding feast. Perseus and Andromeda would be married, and it would be a celebration worthy of a hero and a princess. But there was a complication, one that no one had mentioned to Perseus yet. Andromeda had already been promised to someone else. Her uncle, Phineus, had been engaged to marry her before the whole sea monster incident. And Phineus had not been happy about the sacrifice, not because he loved Andromeda and wanted to save her, but because he felt that Andromeda belonged to him, and he didn't appreciate someone else, even a hero, coming in and taking what was his. So in the middle of the wedding feast, Phineus arrived with armed men. He burst into the celebration and demanded that Andromeda be turned over to him. She was his betrothed, he claimed. Perseus had no right to her. The fact that Perseus had saved her life was, in Phineus's mind, irrelevant. Perseus, who'd been having a fairly good day up to this point, was not impressed. He tried to reason with Phineus, pointed out that Phineus had done nothing to save Andromeda when she was chained to the rock, asked where Phineus had been when Cetus was about to devour her. But Phineus wasn't interested in logic or justice. He wanted Andromeda, and he'd brought enough armed men to take her by force. The wedding celebration turned into a brawl. Swords were drawn. Men started fighting. Perseus, outnumbered and surrounded, made a quick decision. He called out a warning to Andromeda and anyone loyal to him to close their eyes or look away. Then he reached into the kibbasis, pulled out Medusa's head and held it high. Everyone who was looking at him, everyone with their eyes open in that moment, turned to stone. Phineus and his men became statues, frozen in mid-battle, their expressions of aggression transformed into permanent stone grimaces. In some versions, even King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia were turned to stone, because they'd taken Phineus's side against Perseus, a final punishment for Cassiopeia's pride and Cepheus's willingness to sacrifice his daughter. With his enemies dealt with, Perseus put Medusa's head away. The wedding could continue. He and Andromeda were married, and they prepared to travel together back to Seriphos. Perseus had a score to settle with King Polydectes, and now he had both a weapon powerful enough to do it and a wife to protect as well as his mother. The journey back to Seriphos must have been bittersweet for Perseus. He'd accomplished impossible things. He'd slain Medusa, rescued a princess, defeated a sea monster, married a woman he loved. He was returning home not as the fisherman's ward, but as a true hero, son of Zeus, carrier of a weapon that could turn armies to stone. But he also knew what he'd find when he returned. Polydectes had sent him on this quest to die. The king had planned to take advantage of his absence, to force Danae into marriage. Perseus could only hope that Dictys had been able to protect her, that his mother had managed to avoid the king's advances for however long Perseus had been gone. When Perseus, Andromeda and their companions arrived at Seriphos, they went first to Dictys's house. That's where they'd been living before, and that's where Danae should have been. But the house was empty. Dictys was gone too. Perseus, with growing dread, asked around the town, where was his mother? Where was Dictys? The townspeople, recognizing Perseus and shocked that he'd returned alive, told him the truth. As soon as Perseus had left, Polydectes had intensified his pursuit of Danae. He'd been relentless, using his power as king to pressure her. When she'd continued to refuse him, he'd resorted to force. Danae had fled to the temple of Athena for sanctuary, one of the few places where even a king couldn't drag her out without blasphemy. And Dictys, trying to protect her, had stood up to his brother, which had earned him imprisonment or exile depending on which version you hear. So Perseus's fears were confirmed. His mother had been under siege the entire time he was gone. She was alive, she'd managed to avoid the actual marriage, but she'd been forced to live as a refugee in a temple, afraid to come out, while Polydectes effectively ruled as a tyrant over the island. Perseus went to the temple. There he found his mother thin, worn, but alive. Their reunion must have been emotional. Danae had been certain she'd never see her son again. She'd said goodbye to him, believing he was going to his death. And now here he was, not only alive but triumphant and with a new wife by his side. But there was unfinished business. Polydectes needed to be dealt with. Perseus left Andromeda and his mother in the safety of the temple and went to the palace. He knew Polydectes would be there. The king liked his comforts, and besides, he had no reason to hide. He thought Perseus was dead, turned to stone somewhere far away, his bones already scattered by scavengers. When Perseus walked into the palace, King Polydectes was in the middle of another feast. He was surrounded by his nobles and supporters, men who'd backed him in his persecution of Danae and Dictys. The conversation probably died when Perseus appeared. The guards might have moved to stop him, but Perseus had a presence now, a confidence born of having done impossible things. And he had Hermes' sandals still, Hades' helm, the divine sword. He was visibly not someone to trifle with. Polydectes, for his part, must have been shocked. But he was also a king, used to maintaining control, used to being obeyed. So he put on a false smile, welcomed Perseus back, asked about the quest. Where was this head of Medusa that Perseus had promised? Surely the boy hadn't actually accomplished such an impossible task. Perseus looked around the room, at Polydectes on his throne surrounded by men who'd helped him terrorize Danae, at the false smiles and sneering faces. These were men who'd thought themselves safe, thought themselves above consequence, because they served the king. Men who'd sent a youth off to die and never expected to face any punishment for it. Perseus reached for the kibisis. He announced clearly that everyone should look away unless they wanted to see what he'd brought back. Some people, sensing danger, covered their eyes or turned their heads. But Polydectes and most of his supporters, drunk on wine and power, just laughed. They thought it was a bluff. They thought Perseus was stalling, making excuses because he'd failed. So Perseus pulled out Medusa's head. and everyone who was looking, everyone with their eyes on him in that moment, turned to stone. The transformation was instant. Polydectes, mid-laugh, his mouth open, his hand holding a wine cup, became a stone statue. His supporters similarly frozen, their expressions of mockery and cruelty preserved forever in stone. The palace, which moments before had been full of life and noise and cruel laughter, became silent except for the gasps of those who'd looked away in time. Perseus carefully put the head away. Then he went to the prison where Dictys was being held and freed him. With Polydectes dead and his supporters turned to stone, there was no resistance. The island needed a new king, and Perseus, who could have claimed that title himself, instead gave it to Dictys. The kind fisherman who'd rescued him and his mother all those years ago, who'd protected them as best he could, deserved to be king far more than Perseus did. With Seriphos secure, with his mother safe and Dictys ruling justly, Perseus made one final act before leaving the island. He'd held on to the divine weapons throughout his quest, but they were borrowed items, meant to be returned. He gave back Hermes' sandals and Hades' helmet, returning them to the gods who'd lent them. The divine sword he kept, but only for a time. And Medusa's head, that terrible weapon, he gave to Athena. The goddess took it and mounted it on her aegis, her shield, or in some versions, her breastplate. There it would stay forever, the face of Medusa glaring out from Athena's armor, turning enemies to stone. Medusa, who'd been Athena's priestess, then her victim, then her monster, became in death Athena's weapon and symbol. The snakes, the terrifying visage, became an emblem called the Gorgonean, used throughout Greek culture to ward off evil. It's deeply ironic. The woman who was turned into a monster as punishment became a symbol of protection, her face used to scare away danger. With the quest complete, with his mother safe and married, Perseus might have thought his story was over. He'd accomplished everything he'd set out to do. He'd survived what should have killed him. He'd become a true hero. But there was still that prophecy hanging over him, over his entire life. The oracle had told King Acrisius that he would be killed by his grandson, and Perseus, whether he knew it or not, was fated to fulfill that prophecy. Perseus, Andromeda, and Danae set off from Seriphos, traveling to Argos. Danae wanted to return to her homeland, to see if there could be any reconciliation with her father, now that so many years had passed. Perseus, confident in his abilities and his divine protection, thought there shouldn't be any problem. He was a hero now. Surely his grandfather would welcome him. But when Acrisius heard that Perseus was coming, that his grandson was alive and traveling toward Argos, terror gripped him. The prophecy came rushing back. He hadn't thought about it in years, had convinced himself that Danae and the baby had surely died in that chest on the sea. But they hadn't died. Perseus was alive, was a hero, was coming toward him. And the oracle's words were absolute. His grandson would kill him. So Acrisius did what he'd always done. He ran. He fled Argos, abdicated his throne, left everything behind, and traveled far away. He went to Larissa in Thessaly, a city far enough from Argos that he thought he'd be safe. And there, he tried to live quietly, anonymously. Just another old man trying to disappear into a new city. Meanwhile, Perseus arrived in Argos only to find that his grandfather had fled. He learned about the prophecy for the first time, learned why Danae had been imprisoned, why they'd been cast out to sea. It must have been a shock to realize that his entire life, all the suffering his mother had endured, stemmed from his grandfather's fear of a prophecy about him. But Perseus didn't pursue Acrisius. He didn't go looking for revenge. Instead, he took over Argos, became its king. He'd earned that right by lineage and by deed, and Argos prospered under his rule. He and Andromeda had children together, many children. Sons who would become kings and warriors, daughters who would marry into other royal lines. Perseus was building a dynasty, a legacy that would extend far beyond his own life. And perhaps that's where the story should have ended. Perseus as king, living happily with his wife and children, his mother finally at peace, his grandfather living out his days in distant exile. But the fates don't allow for tidy endings. Prophecies must be fulfilled. Sometime later, Perseus traveled to Larissa. Not to hunt his grandfather. He didn't even know Acrisius was there. Perseus was going because there were funeral games being held, athletic competitions in honor of a king who'd recently died. These games were a big event, drawing competitors from all over Greece. Perseus, as a king and a hero, wanted to participate. It was expected. It was an honor. So Perseus went to the games. He competed in various events, and one of the events was the discus throw, or in some versions, it was the javelin. Either way, it involved throwing a heavy object as far as you could. Perseus, strong and skilled, hurled the discus with all his might. It flew far farther than he'd intended, and in the crowd of spectators, standing in what should have been a safe area, was an old man who'd come to watch the games. The discus struck the old man on the head. The impact killed him instantly, and when they carried the body to identify it, Perseus learned the truth. The man he'd accidentally killed was his grandfather, Acrisius. The prophecy was fulfilled, not through murder or intention, not through a fight or a confrontation, but through pure accident, through fate arranging circumstances in a way that couldn't have been predicted, but also couldn't have been avoided. Acrisius had run as far as he could, had hidden as well as he could, and it hadn't mattered. Perseus had gone about his normal life, not seeking vengeance, and it hadn't mattered. The oracle's words came true because they had to come true. Perseus was devastated. Despite everything Acrisius had done to him and his mother, Perseus hadn't wanted this. He was guilty of manslaughter, even though it was accidental. According to Greek custom, he had to be purified, had to undergo ritual cleansing. And he couldn't stay in Argos. Even though he'd done nothing intentionally wrong, the pollution of having killed a family member, even by accident, meant he had to leave. So Perseus gave up the throne of Argos. He exchanged kingdoms with Megapenthes, who ruled neighboring Tiryns. This was an acceptable solution. Perseus still had a kingdom, still had power and responsibility, but he'd been removed from Argos, the scene of his crime. And from this new base in Tiryns, Perseus went on to found another city, Mycenae, one of the most important cities in all of Greek mythology, the golden city that would stand for centuries. Perseus and Andromeda ruled Tiryns and Mycenae for many years. They had a large family, 7 sons and 2 daughters according to most accounts. Their son Perses was said to be the founder of the Persian race, carried east to establish new kingdoms. Another son, Electryon, would become the grandfather of Heracles, making Perseus the great-grandfather of Greece's most famous hero. Through his children, Perseus's bloodline spread across Greece and beyond. His descendants became known as the Perseids, a royal dynasty that claimed descent from Zeus through Perseus. Kings in Mycenae, Tiryns, and other cities traced their lineage back to him. The connection to the divine through both Zeus and the heroic deeds gave these rulers legitimacy and prestige. But Perseus's legacy wasn't just about bloodlines and dynasties. His story became one of the most popular in Greek culture. Artists painted scenes from his life on pottery and walls. Sculptors carved him in marble, usually showing him holding Medusa's head, his greatest trophy. Poets retold his adventures, sometimes making them more elaborate, adding details or changing circumstances. The story of Perseus killing Medusa became a template for the hero's journey. A young man given an impossible task, aided by the gods, facing a terrible monster, and emerging victorious. It appeared in ancient plays that are now lost. It was referenced by historians. It became part of the educational curriculum, a story every Greek child would know. But more than that, Perseus's story became intertwined with astronomy. The ancient Greeks saw stories in the stars, and many of the figures from Perseus's adventure were immortalized as constellations. Perseus himself became a constellation in the northern sky. Andromeda became one too, depicted as chained to the rock even among the stars. Cassiopeia, Cepheus, and even Cetus, the sea monster, all became constellations. Looking up at the night sky, ancient astronomers could trace out the entire myth written in stars. This celestial mapping did something important. It made the myth permanent, written not just in scrolls that could burn or pottery that could shatter, but in the eternal patterns of the heavens. Every night, the story of Perseus and Andromeda played out above, visible to anyone who looked up. The ancient world saw time as cyclical, and the stars reinforced that. The same constellations appearing season after season, year after year, the same stories repeating eternally. For Perseus personally, His later life seems to have been relatively peaceful. He ruled well, he raised his children, he lived to old age, which in Greek mythology is actually remarkable. So many heroes died young, cut down in battle, or by the gods or by fate. But Perseus, who'd survived so much in his youth, was allowed to grow old, and when he died peacefully, surrounded by family, having lived a full life. Some versions even say the gods took him up to Olympus after his death, making him immortal like his father Zeus. But whether that's true or just wishful thinking from later writers, Perseus's story lived on. The cities he founded prospered. His children and grandchildren became legends in their own right. The weapons he'd used were preserved and treasured, and the story of how a young man from a fishing village became one of Greece's greatest heroes continued to inspire people for centuries. But what about Medusa? Her death was not the end of her story. If anything, it was just the beginning of her transformation from individual to icon. The head that Perseus had given to Athena retained all its power. Even in death, even severed from her body, Medusa's eyes could still petrify. Any enemy who looked at the aegis, at the shield or breastplate where Athena had mounted the head, would turn to stone instantly. This made Athena even more fearsome in battle. Already the goddess of war strategy, now she had a weapon that no armor could defend against, no shield could block. You couldn't fight something you couldn't look at. Athena's aegis became one of the most recognizable symbols in Greek art and culture. The Gorgonean, the face of Medusa, appeared everywhere. On shields, on buildings, on coins, on jewelry. The purpose was apotropaic, meaning it was meant to ward off evil. The idea was that the face that could turn you to stone would also scare away bad spirits, bad luck, and bad people. It was protection through terror. People wore Medusa amulets or painted her face above their doorways. Soldiers had her image on their armor. It was believed that evil couldn't stand to look at something more terrible than itself. But there's a profound irony in this. Medusa, the victim who was transformed into a monster, became a symbol of protection. The face that represented her punishment became a face that supposedly protected others. She'd been made monstrous against her will, and that monstrousness was then harnessed and used by the very goddess who'd cursed her in the first place. Over time, as centuries passed and Greek culture gave way to Roman and then medieval European culture, Medusa's story evolved. The Romans kept her, but changed details. In Roman tellings, she became more explicitly a monster, less of a victim. Medieval writers, working from Roman sources, made her even more monstrous, divorcing her entirely from her origins as a human woman. But then something interesting happened. During the Renaissance, artists and writers rediscovered the older Greek versions of the myth. They found the accounts that mentioned Medusa was once beautiful, once human, and they started to wonder about her story. Painters began depicting her differently, not always as a grotesque monster, but sometimes as tragically beautiful even in death. Caravaggio's famous Medusa, painted in the 1590s, shows her face at the moment of death, her expression one of shock and pain, her features still human despite the serpents. This rehumanization of Medusa continued through the centuries. Romantic-era poets saw her as a tragic figure. Victorian writers played with the ambiguity of the monster who was also a victim. And then, in the 20th century, something else happened. Medusa became a feminist icon. Writers and scholars, particularly women, began pointing out what had always been in the myth but what had been glossed over or ignored. That Medusa was punished for being raped, that she was blamed for a crime committed against her, that her transformation into a monster was unjust. These readings saw Medusa not as the villain of Perseus's story, but as a victim of patriarchal divine justice. Her story became a metaphor for how women, especially survivors of sexual violence, are often blamed for their own victimization. The French feminist theorist Hélène Cixous wrote an essay called The Laugh of the Medusa, in which she reclaimed Medusa as a symbol of female power and rage. She argued that Medusa wasn't something to be feared, but something to embrace, that her power to petrify was actually a power to make people see truth they couldn't handle. The essay was influential, and the image of Medusa as a symbol of female anger, of justified rage against injustice, took hold. Today, Medusa appears in all sorts of contexts. She's in movies, books, video games, art. Sometimes she's a villain, sometimes she's a hero, sometimes she's complicated both at once. Her image has been used by survivors of sexual assault as a way to reclaim power, to say that they refuse to be victims, that they have teeth now that they can fight back. Medusa tattoos have become popular for this reason, worn by people who identify with her transformation, with making something powerful out of pain. But even in modern retellings, Perseus's role is being questioned and reconsidered. In some newer versions, he's not the heroic figure, but the villain, or at least morally ambiguous. He's the man who killed a victim, who was used by the gods to silence a woman who'd already been silenced once. These interpretations don't make him evil exactly, but they acknowledge the complexity of the situation. Perseus was used by fate and the gods just as much as Medusa was, but his use benefited him, while hers destroyed her. The relationship between Perseus and Medusa has become in many ways a case study in how we tell stories about heroes and monsters. Who gets to be the hero? Who gets called a monster? And what does it mean when the monster used to be human, used to be innocent, used to be someone who deserved protection rather than punishment? These are questions that the ancient Greeks might not have asked explicitly, but they're embedded in the myth they created, and we're still wrestling with them today. Medusa's power, it turns out, wasn't just the ability to turn people to stone. It was the power of her story to persist, to evolve, to mean different things to different people across different eras. Perseus's quest might have been to kill her, but in a very real sense he failed. She couldn't be killed. Not really. She lives on in every retelling, every reinterpretation, every time someone sees her face and recognizes something of themselves in her tragedy. The ancient Greeks placed both Perseus and his victim among the stars, perhaps recognizing that their stories were two sides of the same coin, both necessary to understand the full picture. And up there in the heavens, the constellation of Perseus holds the star Algol, whose name comes from the Arabic Ras al Ghul, meaning the demon's head. That star, located where Perseus holds Medusa's head in the constellation, is actually a variable star. It dims and brightens periodically, as if Medusa's eye is still opening and closing, still watching, still possessing power even in death, even in the stars. And that's the story of Perseus and Medusa, a tale of prophecy and fate, of heroes and monsters, of gods who meddle and mortals who suffer, of death that isn't the end and power that takes many forms. It's a story that has everything: divine parentage and impossible quests, cunning trickery and brave combat, true love and righteous vengeance, and at its heart, a tragedy about a woman who did nothing wrong but paid the ultimate price, and a hero who accomplished everything but was still bound by fate. The ancient Greeks told this story to explain the stars, to teach lessons about the gods, to entertain and to warn. We still tell it today because it speaks to something eternal, the way power works, the way stories change depending on who's telling them, the way victims can become symbols, the way heroes can be complicated, the way everyone, god and mortal alike, is caught in patterns larger than themselves. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of Greek mythology's most enduring tales. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to like it and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue to bring you these explorations of myths and legends from around the world. And let me know in the comments what you'd like to see next. What other Greek myths should we explore? What other mythological traditions interest you? Until next time, keep looking up at the stars and remembering the stories they hold. This has been Mythic Dreamscapes. Sleep well, and thanks for watching.